Hey there, my name is Camilla. I am 16 years old, and boy, do I have an interesting story to tell you. I am from the rather dry climate of Egypt, so yes, I am Egyptian. I'm very proud of my heritage, and I wouldn't want to live anywhere else in the world than among the hot sand. I had a great childhood. No brokenness or real hardship came with it. My parents were actually rather wealthy, and they both loved each other a lot. I always felt extremely lucky to have been blessed with such an upbringing. I knew there were many people in my country who didn't have this kind of fortune. Everything was great, until suddenly it wasn't. My mother was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. At this point in the development of cancer, that meant it was terminal. It felt like someone had pulled the rug out from under my feet. I didn't understand how this could have happened, why good people like my mother had to have such horrible illnesses. They had estimated that her life expectancy would be around 2 years. She died less than 6 months later. From that point on, everything changed. My dad spiraled into a deep depression, and I can't really fault him for that. He had lost his partner, his soulmate. I had lost my mother, so I was right there with him in that time of grieving. My father's intense grieving and depression led him to make some extremely poor decisions. A few lapses in judgment later, and we were out of money. I suddenly went from being well off to not being certain if there would be bread on the table at night. It was awful. My whole world had changed in under a year. I missed my mother terribly, and I still do to this day. I would often sit in bed at night and pray that she would just come back and make everything whole again, make it right. I knew it was falling on deaf ears, and that she was gone, but it was the silly hope that kept me going some days. Due to our lack of funds, we were forced to sell our house in the city area. It was like letting go of the last bit of my childhood as we left it behind. We moved to this little slum-looking area in a small village, and our house looked pretty weathered and old. I wasn't exactly thrilled with the condition, but I figured it was better than not having any shelter at all. I told myself I should be grateful we even have a house after all this, but it was hard not to feel robbed. There weren't many other teenagers around the place, as it was a pretty tiny village. There seemed to be more older folk and poor small families with babies than anything else. I felt isolated and extremely alone. I had a hard time falling asleep that night, as I kept thinking about how much I'd rather be in my bed back at my old house. After what felt like forever, I was able to drift off into a fitful sleep. I had a rather strange dream that night. It was in vivid detail about a room in my house. I remember my dream self opening the door and digging through it frantically. I then uncovered this massive treasure, bigger and shinier than anything I had ever seen before. I remember the feelings of excitement and awe as I had stared down at my findings. When I woke up, I still had this racing feeling of excitement and anticipation. I tried to tell myself that it was only a dream, that it really didn't mean anything, but I couldn't stop wondering. It was so real, and it was so specific that it gave me another reason to hope again. I remember sitting at the table with my father that morning, enthusiastically describing to him the dream in all its vivid detail. He sat there and let me ramble, giving a tired smile as I waved my arms wildly as I described everything to him. That would be nice, if this old house had some sort of secret treasure. Maybe one day we can be that lucky, he had told me. I was glad he shared that same feeling of hope. After that, he didn't mention the dream again, and I didn't feel it necessary to linger on it. I figured it was just a dream anyway, but I was definitely going to do some serious exploring in my house at some point. I was too busy at the moment, however, attempting to fit in with my new school. I didn't have any issues finding my place among my peers, and I was generally pretty happy with where I was. I guess going from a place of wealth to one of poverty humbled me a bit. If I had the opportunity to become wealthy again, however, I would take it in an instant. No one could fault me for that, right? I remember coming back from school once and seeing a couple of men in my living room speaking with my father. I didn't catch anything they were saying, as they seemed to clam up the moment I entered the room. I felt a little suspicious, but I assumed maybe my father was trying to make friends himself. It had been rather lonely for him since Mom died, after all. My father simply gestured for them to follow him, and they disappeared into a room. I heard the click of the door lock, and I was even more befuddled. What were they hiding? That was too suspicious to simply write off. Strange men in my home? My dad speaking to them in secret? Locking the door to his room? Yeah, something was definitely going on here, and I was determined to figure out what it was. It became a normal routine after that. I would return from school, I'd see those same people in my house, and they'd lock themselves in that room. I would put a cup up to the door and place my ear on it, trying to catch any sort of sound. I never really heard them speaking, but I could hear a lot of shuffling around and a lot of loud thumps. It almost sounded like they were trying to bring the whole house down with the noise. I wanted to just shrug it off and say, maybe Dad is just doing some reconstruction or fixing up a spot in the wall with some workers. But we didn't have the money for that. I was always waiting for an opportunity to see what was behind that door, patiently waiting for them to break routine and leave it unlocked. I got my chance one day when I noticed the two strange men were absent and my father was outside in the yard. I figured this was the best chance I was gonna get, and I hurried to the room. I tested the doorknob and was surprised, yet delighted, to find it unlocked. I quickly shoved the door open and hurried inside the room. Looking back on it now, I really should have taken a moment to see what was in the room before just running inside. The next thing I knew, the ground had disappeared from underneath me, and I was falling. I remember giving out a short scream of shock and terror before I hit the ground with a painful impact. I checked over my body and was relieved to find nothing appeared to be broken. Then I finally took a moment to look around me and... where was I? I felt like I was in some sort of grave, but a large and nicely decorated grave. The stone and dirt were carved intricately into designs and pillars, and it gave me a sort of ancient vibe from the way it loomed over me. There were old paintings on the wall closest to me, and I could recognize some things in the picture, like the god Anubis and his scales. I suddenly felt dread as I realized this indeed was a glorified grave. I was in some sort of tomb. Why was there a tomb in my house? Better yet, why was there a giant hole in this room that led down into this tomb? I could see a few statues of cats a little ways away from me, and a few engravings of ankhs and other ancient tomes of my ancestors. This was crazy! And then I started to wonder if there could be a sarcophagus in here. Was there a mummy? Did they have all the typical stuff the Egyptians of the past were buried with to take to the afterlife with them? I imagined the blades and amulets and jewels that might lie beside the deceased person for their trip to the next life. The wonder started to fade as I looked up and realized that I was a long ways down. There was no way I could pull myself back up out of the tomb and into my house. I started to panic and think that this would be my tomb now. I was in there for maybe only 20 minutes before a rope ladder was unfolded down into the hole. I scrambled up it as quickly as I could, and suddenly my father was pulling me up and out of the tomb, and into what little floor there was in the room. He scolded me for carelessly barging into a room he had made it very clear he didn't want me to be in. I wasn't having that, though. Not after everything I had just seen. What is all of this? Why is there a hole in our house? Why is there a tomb just sitting here behind this door? What are you even doing with it? I had demanded of him frantically. He looked uncomfortable, but ultimately told me that he had found himself wrapped up in what he called tray stealing. Apparently, that meant robbing tombs of their artifacts and selling them off to people. It wasn't exactly a legal thing to do, I'm pretty sure. He said he was desperate to become wealthy again, that he was tired of not being sure if he could support us. He said he would do whatever it took to regain his monetary status. I was shocked, especially when he forbid me from speaking a word of what I saw today. I wasn't allowed to tell anyone about this, or about what my father was doing. I don't know how I feel about this. I mean, it's not right. They're defiling someone's resting place and basically grave robbing for their own benefit. I understand we need money, but there has to be some other way than this, right? I could just as easily inform our authorities of this. But then what? My dad gets arrested, and what happens to me? I wouldn't have anyone left, and who knows where I would end up. I love my dad, but I don't love what he's doing. I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place right now, and I really don't know what to do next.